All right, guys, so let's get into it. Today we are going to be doing the November 2021 opening lab where I'm going to be answering questions from Patreon. We do this once a month. People submit questions on our Patreon page, and then I go and do a little bit of research and then answer folks' questions. If you're here listening live in the chat, you're welcome to ask follow-up questions on anything we look at or discuss, but I probably won't be able to get to any new questions because I do have to respect that I'm answering these specific questions that were submitted. So if you ask about some random opening that we're not really talking about, there's a good chance I'll probably just skip over your question. But at the end of the show, I might have some extra time for additional questions anyway, if you are watching live. Okay, so with that, let's get into it. Let's get our first question here. We have from Dean G, who's been submitting some good questions lately. And Dean G is asking, okay, this is a bit of a more abstract opening question, but as an e4 player, when is it right to develop the c1 bishop to g5? When I was a beginner, I would often put it there to pin the knight on f6 automatically, but as an intermediate player, I never do it for fear of getting kicked around by h6, g5, or losing the bishop pair. Yeah, so David actually made a point on this move, bishop g5, I think during like one of the Ultimate Sensei streams, the recent one with the draft tournament. And yeah, developing the bishop to g5 is not always as aggressive as it might appear as first glance, and often just not that great or that challenging of a move. So very good question from Dean, and there's no perfect answer here. So I think what we'll do is we'll just look at a couple of variations where the bishop comes out to g5 and see if we can figure out some unique patterns here. So yeah, there are many openings where the bishop just gets developed to g5 and it's quite good. Pretty well-known one is, of course, the Najdorf variation of the poison pawn. Well, bishop g5 is one move that white can play here, and then if black wants to, they can go for the poison pawn, e6, queen b6. I said Najdorf variation of the poison. I meant poison pawn variation of the Najdorf. So this is one where white develops the bishop out to g5 quite early, and what we'll see in a lot of these different variations is we're mainly doing this when we do have a response to h6, when this move h6 is not going to be so bothersome. So in this exact position, for example, if black were to play h6, then white is just taking on f6 and doubling the pawns, and this isn't a really good structure for black. gf6 or ef6, whatever, white goes bishop to c4, and yeah, black just has a ton of weaknesses. Light squares are a big problem. Queen can come out to like h5, and this is really not great for black. So one thing we can say right away is, like, generally bishop g5 is nice when it actually comes with a threat and we have some kind of plan against this h6 move. And what often happens here is black will typically play e6, white usually goes f4, just taking space in the center, taking the e5 square. And here if black plays h6, white is just ready to drop the bishop back to h4. Because yeah, in general, we don't want to just trade on f6 unless we actually get something for it. We don't just want to give up our dark squared bishop without getting something in return. But let's look at a couple of other positions where bishop g5 maybe isn't as good. Actually, one example I should point out is the classical Sicilian. Also very similar here. White plays bishop g5. This is one of the main moves. Here this move is again very logical because in this kind of Sicilian, black is often trying to play for g6 and actually play more of a dragon setup. So if white were to play some other move here, like bishop to e2, for example, then many players from black's point of view would play g6, bishop g7, and have a very reasonable dragon. So bishop g5 is considered critical in this position because this is the one move, or one of the only moves that actually kind of discourages black from playing g6. I think some players do this one anyway, but again, this structure is not supposed to be so great for black, especially here. d6 pawn is isolated, d5 square is now weak. I believe the theory is that white continues bishop to b5, plays on the light squares, and is generally doing pretty well here. So again, this move is very logical because, yeah, white is really not worried about h6, and here we're actually threatening to take on f6 and double black's pawns. Now, classical Sicilian is very interesting because, of course, this bishop stays on g5 for a while. The main line here is to play e6. White typically goes queen to d2. And now black has a lot of moves, but it's interesting that if black were to play h6 here, one idea maybe not a lot of people know about is that white can just take on f6 right in this position. And this is kind of white's point. Now if black plays queen takes f6, the idea is to go knight db5, or hitting this one, or hitting d6. The queen has to go back to d8 to cover, then white can castle queenside. And now the d6 pawn is a huge target, and yeah, this is very difficult position. Black is already probably just losing a pawn here. So that's why the main line nowadays in this position, I believe, is to play a6, so stopping all kinds of knight b5 ideas. I think bishop e7 is also playable. And just to make a quick note, after h6 takes, black can take gf6, and this is probably the better recapture here. And this kind of structure does come up a lot in, like, let's say the classical Sicilian, but I'm not sure if black really wants to spend the tempo on h6 here, because sometimes white just ends up taking and forcing the double pawns anyway, so this tempo for black might not be worth it, since eventually black is going to want to play h5 just in one move. So this is one where, again, I think the bishop on g5 is pretty active and ends up a good choice for white. Now, a couple openings where bishop g5 is considered, let's say, not so aggressive is actually one good example is the French. If we go to the Rubinstein French with d takes e4, knight takes e4, for example, knight d7, where black prepares to put the knight on f6. Here after knight f3, knight gf6, a lot of players play the move bishop g5 here, but it's really not actually that great for white. Like, it looks like we're pinning and that looks super active, but what I found is that when black can just break the pin very easily with bishop to e7, a lot of times what happens with this pin is that we actually just get a lot of exchanges. Now that the pin is broken, the knight on e4 is of course under attack, and with this move bishop e7, black is just trying to encourage lots of trades, which is good for the second player because they don't have as much space. So for example, knight takes f6, black can play bishop takes f6. Now I think nowadays some players are playing h4 here. I saw some games with this position, and it looks like white is still trying to fight for an advantage, but in general this was considered not that dangerous for black because we're just getting a lot of piece trades right from the opening. Black can also play h6 in this position, which I think is totally reasonable, and then if white plays takes, let's say bishop h4, then the bishop loses a little bit of flexibility because now it's committed to the king side. It can no longer drop back here. And if we think about this position from, like, just kind of long-term planning sense, a lot of times white is trying to castle queen side, black will castle king side, and white is trying to attack on the king side. With the bishop on h4, that's not quite as conducive. It's actually kind of a little bit in the way because you would want to play like h4, g4 if you're trying to attack on the king side. So my feeling is that the bishop is better placed somewhere on e3 so that it can just point at the king side. So that's why the main move among strong players in this position is not to play bishop to g5. If you look at the database, pretty much everyone is playing knight takes f6 here at the top level, and after black recaptures, this bishop usually comes out either to e3, sometimes f4, but generally e3 is the square, so bishop e3, very common move. And then I think a really good setup here for white is like bishop d3, queen comes out, castle queenside, and then you play for the kingside play. So yeah, this is one example where the pin is just not very dangerous. And then another really classic set of positions come from, let's say, the e4, e5 family. So for example, in the Italian game, let's take the slow Italian where white plays d3, c3. Of course, there's like a million different move orders here, a million different ways to play it. a4, bishop b3, knight d2, castles, h3. These are all kind of normal moves for white. And then black is playing like d6, a6, bishop a7, sometimes h6, castles, etc. So lots and lots of different move orders here. And in these kinds of positions, it's always a big question whether white should be trying to play bishop to g5. Now, when I was growing up, the traditional kind of logic for these positions was as follows. From white's point of view, you really shouldn't play bishop to g5 until the opponent is castled. And the reason for that is because once black is castled, then it's a lot less solid for them to kick your bishop with h6 and g5. Because white would like to play bishop to g5 and then meet h6 with bishop h4, keeping the pin. That's kind of ideal. Once again, in general, we don't want to play bishop g5 just to trade off the bishop, and we don't want to play bishop g5 if, in response to h6, we're just going to be backing up. So maybe the most important thing I can say in this whole segment is, like, if you're going to play bishop to g5, you should have some kind of plan against h6. If you're happy to maintain the pin, then you need to make sure that g5 is not a problem. So let's say black plays d6. And yeah, here I would think it's a little bit too early to play bishop to g5 because black can play h6, bishop h4, and let's say just immediate g5, bishop to g3. And then the point is that black's king is not committed to castle kingside. Black can play bishop g4, queen d7, castle queenside. And I think, well, from what I remember, I feel like black typically gets a very good game in this kind of situation. And it's even worse if, let's say, white castles first, and then black makes a move like a6, which is kind of like a useful move, and then white plays bishop to g5 here. This is kind of considered a big no-no from white's point of view because, again, h6 and g5, and black is actually just getting a ton of tempi for their attack. Once again, they're going to castle queenside, the h-pawn is going to run down the board, and white's king on g1 here is kind of a sitting duck. So when I was growing up, this was always considered kind of, again, a no-no. And what you're supposed to do is wait for black to castle, and if black commits to castling the king, then bishop g5 is playable. It's not the only way to play the position. You can, of course, resort to the classic knight d2, knight f1, knight g3. That's always available to white. But once black is castled, then it was kind of considered that bishop g5 is now a very playable move because on h6, bishop h4, black can go g5 here, but number one, the sacrifice knight takes g5 is now a lot more tempting when the king is on g8, and sometimes can be very strong in these positions. But number two, even if white just plays simply with bishop to g3 back, it's really not comfortable, in my opinion. Black's pawns are on h6 and g5 with the king on g8. The engine might think that black is okay here, but in practice, from a human point of view, black has given up some squares on the king side, and the general plan is to try to bring the knight somewhere to e3 or g3 here, and eventually use the weakness of the f5 square. So I think in the long run, this position in practice feels a little bit easier from white's point of view. So that was always kind of like the classic logic of these positions. You don't want to play bishop g5 from white's point of view unless black is already castled, and then h6, g5 is not as great for them. But nowadays, you know, things have started changing, and we have seen lots of players at the very top level, guys like Aronian and you know, MVL, Caruana, Magnus, all these guys, they have started experimenting with like bishop g5 in different positions. And who knows, in a couple of years, you know, the theory might be totally different here. I'm just kind of explaining the logic that I remember learning about growing up, which made a lot of sense. But nowadays, with the new engines, new ideas, you know, people are playing bishop g5 all over the place, allowing black to play h6, g5, and then somehow arguing that that weakness is still worth it for white to provoke, even though black isn't castled there. But my advice would be probably to avoid it unless you have a really good response to h6. So hopefully, Dean, that answers your question. Of course, typical disclaimers, you know, every chess position is different, and there are very few rules, you know, that you can just use 100% of the time. You really have to learn to think about each position individually, but hopefully this was at least a little bit helpful to decide, you know, when bishop g5 is useful and when it might just be leading to trades or not really doing a whole lot. Okay, let's see if I missed any chats here. Yeah, in general, like this bishop g5 pin is not going to be super dangerous, especially if you're not having some kind of like knight c3, knight d5 follow-up. The pin is mostly, I would say, just kind of like a positional pressure type of thing. You're putting the pin there, black can't move the knight, you know, they can't move the queen either because then you take on f6 and double their pawns. So it's kind of uncomfortable to deal with. The opponent usually doesn't want to play h6, g5 to weaken their king side and chase away. So the pin can be kind of like a positional pressure tool, but sometimes it just doesn't give that much pressure, and so it's not really worth a whole lot in the first place. Okay, let's go to the next question here. So thanks, Dean, for that. I think that was a really good question. All right, and next one comes from Ricker. Alrighty, and Ricker is asking, this is something I haven't seen before. What is it? When I come across weird openings, I just try to develop without blundering. Don't know what else to do as their plans are mysterious. And then we have some moves here, d4, h5, g3, g6. Okay, I put this game into my notes here. So let's take a look. And yeah, I would say the broader question is like, what should you do when the opponent is just playing an unconventional opening and kind of breaking opening principles, not really following rules, and yeah, how to react to this. So let's play through the game, and I do have some thoughts on this one. So this game started d4, h5. Okay, not a great move. I know Aftershock is a big fan of this one, but honestly, I don't love it, guys. It doesn't fight for the center. And I think we should be really happy when the opponent is playing like this. But let's see a couple moves. Let's see what happened in this game. So white played g3, g6, e4, bishop h6, f4. So taking a lot of space. Ricker was playing white here. c6. Yeah, the opponent continues to do some very strange things. Knight c3. Okay, I like that. Developing e6, bishop d2, knight f6, h3, d5, and then takes, queen takes d5, knight f3, bishop g7, and this is the end of the line. And in this final position, I mean, still looks at least somewhat reasonable for white, but it feels like, yeah, white didn't get nearly as much as they could. So my impressions on this game, let me just speak to Ricker for this part mostly, was that white was being really, really reactive to black's opening play. So let me show you guys what I mean. So, okay, white goes d4, normal move, h5, not really fighting for the center. In general, if the opponent is playing some random moves, not fighting for the center, something other than d5, knight f6, I would say white's next move should be e4. Just take the center. It's a big advantage to control the full center. Your pieces get more squares, more access to more parts of the board. You just get a better position. I can't put it simpler than that. So take the center, develop your pieces, and play aggressively because you have the advantage. So I definitely think that white should just be fighting for the center, and let's say black does something similar like this g6, bishop h6 plan. I can't imagine this really can bother us too much because, well, black is spending a lot of time just to trade off some pieces, and here we can play f4 as Ricker does in the game just to take more space. I would also think a move like knight f3 here is absolutely fine. If black wants to take the time to take on c1, okay, whatever, we'll play rook takes c1. I don't see how this slows white down at all. We can just continue developing and we get this kind of perfect opening. And one day, it's not like black can just sit with the king on e8, not develop their pieces, not fight for the center, and expect to survive. One day white's going to castle, start pushing e5, knight g5, going for the attack, and it's going to be really bad for black. I mean, space is quite a problem here. Or white can also even just say bishop takes h6 and argue that after knight takes h6, this knight here is not going to be very well placed. It's going to have a hard time getting into the game. Let's say knight f3, if black tries knight g4, we just kick this guy with h3, and I mean, this knight has really not a lot of squares in the opening. That's why you have to fight for the center, because look at black's position. There are no squares for the pieces to fight for. Knight f6, e5, and the knight has to go backwards, and white is just absolutely crushing here, of course. So yeah, I feel like white's play in this opening was very reactive. So we go g3. I'm not sure if this is our normal, we just want to put the bishop on g2, or maybe this is a reaction to h5. But if anything, this move now totally justifies black's play, because now black actually has a target for this h-pawn. Without this move g2, black's h-pawn is doing very, very little here. Black can try to take some space, but it's just not as important as the center. With g3, now black's pawn absolutely has a hook and actually has something to target. Now black goes g6, we play e4, good move. Bishop h6, we play f4. Again, reactive. It's like we're trying to avoid the trade of bishops. I'm not sure we really need to. I think the move itself is perfectly fine. We're taking a lot of space, but it is kind of indicative of what we'll see in the rest of the game. So c6, knight c3, we're developing. e6, bishop d2. So bishop d2 feels like a very passive move. My guess was that this was aimed at some kind of queen a5. Maybe we were afraid of this pin. Not something to be afraid of. I think white should just be developing the pieces actively. Knight f3, bishop comes out, maybe d3, other bishop to e3, taking more space. Bishop d2 feels very passive. It's not clear that the bishop is so much better here. And yeah, there's a lot of other pieces we could develop before deciding where the bishop goes. Black plays knight f6, now white plays h3. Another move, okay, stopping knight g4, but was knight g4 really a threat? Let's just take a look. let's just develop for white, knight f3, or we can also, just do nothing. But let's play knight f3. If black plays knight g4, is this really a problem? Is the knight really threatening anything? Not really. I would play h3 in this position, and now the knight is actually under attack, and now the knight has to move backwards, and black is losing a lot of time. And then you can decide as white if you want to play e5 or not. I think a number of good options here. Either you play bishop d3 and we're still in total control over the center, or we can go for the absolute kill with e5, knight d5, and knight e4, avoiding the trade in order to fight for some of these juicy outpost squares. Now white is threatening knight d6, which would just end the game strategically because black's whole queenside and kingside would be shut down. White is also threatening just to continue taking space with c4 and then plop the knight into f6, which would be similarly devastating. So yeah, my feeling is that white was just kind of confused, maybe a little intimidated by black's play, being very, very reactive, but this is actually kind of justifying what the opponent does. Although even here, I would say white is doing really, really well because of our good control over the center. Now, finally, black decides to fight for the center with this move d5, and this is where we probably give up a lot of our opening advantage with e takes d5, because we're basically allowing black to trade off a bit and fight for equal space. The right move, in my opinion, I think was e5, just advancing and taking the space, fighting for some kind of advantage, in this case, a space advantage. If black goes backwards, then again, white is just doing really well. We're just developing our pieces. Maybe it'd be worth to spend the tempo to bring the bishop to e3, and I think it's a fantastic position for white. If black hops in with knight to e4, well, we can take this one, and all we need to do is just defend this pawn. So bishop e3, for example, looks very natural to me, and I think black's pawn on e4 is going to be pretty weak. Is this theory? Question from the chat. No, definitely not. The question here is really, how should you deal with, very unconventional opening approaches? And the simple answer is fight for the center. Just take the center, develop your pieces, develop them towards the center. I often see kind of like two mistakes played in the game. Like one opponent starts fighting for these flank moves, which I think are not really useful in the opening. And then their opponent is very reactive, thinking like, oh, maybe they should play h4, or after e4, h4, maybe they should spend a tempo on h3. And when you do this kind of stuff, then you're justifying what the opponent is doing, because then you're like also deciding to waste time in the opening with these flank pawn moves. Whereas instead, we should just be developing our pieces towards the center and eventually trying to attack the king. I think people get really hung up, like whether opening theory, what's the right move here? What's the right move in this opening? It's not really about the right move. It's just about playing good moves, right? Developing your pieces to good squares. It doesn't really matter if the bishop comes out to d3 or c4. If you're controlling the center and you have a good position, either way. So this is more about good opening play rather than, let's say, figuring out, the right approach here or the right move. So yeah, I definitely felt like white's play here just way too reactive and not nearly aggressive enough. I think after knight f6, e5 here would have just been a killer move, for example. And it's not clear where black is going. Knight g4, h3. The knight is actually just trapped and lost. And again, knight d5, we have this nice idea with knight e4, where we're just fighting for all of these nice outpost squares. Not that white isn't much better after knight takes d5 either, with this terrible bishop on c8 and white just having a ton of space. So yeah, after d5 takes, now I think black was starting to get some actual counterplay in the position, even though even here I would think white is still doing quite well after something like bishop e3, bishop g2, and developing and just targeting black's position. But of course, white could have played for much more. Okay, so final thoughts here. It is good to just try to develop, but I think we were way too reactive in this game. These moves, g3, bishop d2, h3, really unnecessary, even though white is better even after all these moves because black wasn't doing anything impressive either. I think we could be fighting for a much bigger advantage. And a long story short here, if the opponent is not fighting for the center and they're playing something weird that you haven't seen before, chances are it's not very good. I would implore you to try to be ambitious, optimistic, especially during a chess game. It's important to be confident and play actively. If you play like your opponent always has like a ton of threats in the position, then you're going to play very passively, and that's really not going to lead to good chess. And that, if anything, that is what's going to give your opponent more chances. So try to play aggressively, try to take space, take the center, take your good position, and then punish people with your good position. If you have a big center, you should be able to crush anyone and everyone in town. So hopefully that helps, Ricker. Let's go to the next question here. Alrighty, next one comes from Jimmy. And let me actually create a little bit more room for this one. Okay, and Jimmy is asking, so I'm confused about the Panov Botvinnik from the Caro. Let's put the Panov Botvinnik attack on the board. So e4, c6, d4, d5, and then the Panov Botvinnik attack is takes, c4. And typically black starts with knight f6 in this position. Okay, so white plays 5 knight c3 almost exclusively and has a 50% score. However, 5 knight f3 is very rarely played, and black scores really well after it, and I'm not sure why. It isn't even mentioned in the book I have on the Caro Khan. So question is, I'm not sure why knight f3 isn't played more seriously, or why the evaluation is equal after 5 g6. It seems like 5 knight c6. Whoops. So knight f3, knight c6. Just transposes back into the main line after 6 knight c3. So yeah, the question is, and I checked this out in the database, and indeed it checks out. Pretty much everyone plays knight c3 here almost exclusively, and not knight f3. And so Jimmy's question is, why is that? So yeah, I think I have an answer for this one. It's not really something I just knew off the top of my head. But let's take a look at some of the lines. So after knight c3, black has a number of options here. e6 is considered very solid. Knight c6 is extremely solid. And there's also this move g6, which I think is not quite as theoretically solid, but leads to maybe more dynamic positions. So some players like this one from black's point of view as well. Now, if black plays e6 or knight c6, then white's next move here is knight f3 in both cases, most of the time. And if white were to start with knight f3 in this position and black were to play e6, then white's next move is pretty much going to be knight c3 virtually all the time as well. So indeed, a lot of these games do transpose to each other, whether white plays knight c3 first or knight f3. If black is playing either e6 or knight c6, as far as I saw, I didn't really see a huge difference. The difference comes with this g6 move. So when white starts with knight c3, if black were to play g6 here, then the main approach from white in this position appears to be the move queen to b3, which makes sense. White puts pressure on d5, and now that black played g6, black doesn't really want to also play e6. Like the move queen b3 wouldn't really make sense if black's pawn was on e6, because then black's d5 square is totally solid. But here, since black has already started with g6, it's not very sound positionally to then also play e6, because the bishop here is going to have to defend a lot of dark squares. Once it comes out to e7, white can put their bishop on h6, for example, and if this bishop comes to g7, then this diagonal is going to be weak on the dark squares as well. So this is kind of white's idea with queen b3, put pressure on d5. Taking on c4, bishop takes c4 is of course annoying as well. And what usually happens here is black just plays bishop to g7 and sacrifices the pawn, allowing white to take on d5, but black's idea is that one day they're going to be able to win it back. So usually black castles here, and then the plan is to play knight d7, knight b6, sometimes a6, b5, followed by bishop to b7. And in general, black just tries to go after the pawn and try to take it. And if black is able to win back the pawn, then everything is fine in their position. And in fact, white has an isolated queen pawn on d4 to look forward to in the future. So here, one of the main ways that white plays is bishop e2. And the point is to put the bishop on f3, bring this knight over to e2. The knight can also come out to f4. And white just tries to hold on to this pawn for as long as possible and essentially not make it easy for black to win this one back. And herein lies the difference. So this plan of bishop e2, bishop f3, this is kind of considered white's main approach here. Had white started with knight f3, well, now g6 is a lot more tempting for black because white isn't nearly close to put enough pressure on d5. So knight c3, for example, bishop g7, queen b3, white is kind of down a tempo from before, and then after castle c takes d5, white is now committed to this move, knight f3, which is considered not as good as playing bishop e2, bishop f3. So here black continues knight d7, and then goes maybe a6, b5, maybe knight b6, just depending on what white does, and then eventually tries to win this pawn back. So this is the main reason that I saw for this, why knight c3 in the opening is vastly more popular than knight f3. Basically, there doesn't seem to be any upside to knight f3 in terms of the move order. If black is playing knight c6 or e6, you're still just going knight c3 anyway. But it does make this option g6 for black more tempting. So just doesn't seem to be any kind of real upside for white in terms of the move order. Okay, Jimmy, hopefully that helps. And I think that pretty much finishes it up on that question. Kind of straightforward answer there, I hope. And let's jump to actually our final question for today, which comes from Kirk D. All right, let me cut this one a bit. Okay, and Kirk is asking, in the Chebanenko Slav with 5 bishop to g5, the common response is d takes c4, but this makes the position rather complex. How do I treat this position best? Yeah, interesting question. So again, we have a question on bishop g5 line, which is kind of interesting. Let's put the Chebanenko Slav on the board, which is d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and now black plays e6. So this is known as the Chebanenko. It's also been referred to as the chameleon Slav because it can, it's basically this a6 move is almost like a semi-waiting move. Like it really helps black's position to cover this b5 square for many reasons, but black is also kind of waiting to see what white does, as then black can then decide what to do with the light squared bishop. So black can consider to follow up with b5 in this kind of position. Black can sometimes play g6, sometimes e6, sometimes the bishop comes out first, or very often I should say, the bishop comes out to g4 or f5, and then black tries to play e6. So a lot of different structures that this one can go, and white has a lot of options. So the exchange, for example, is considered more tempting here because black played this move a6, which might not be as useful in an open position. c5 is also very playable. e3 is a big main line as well. Isn't this the Magnus variation? No, I don't think so. This is known. This has been known for a long time as the Chebanenko Slav, or the chameleon Slav. Now this move bishop g5 doesn't really have the greatest reputation. I think it's quite a risky and very aggressive move for white. But if black knows one or two ideas here, I think white is generally not super happy with this one. And somewhat unfortunately for black, I'm not sure, depending on how you look at it, you do have to go d takes c4 here. This is really important. Actually, let's flip it around. Yeah, I think the line that Magnus likes is in the QGD, although I wouldn't give him credit because it's been played by a lot of players, but he likes playing the Queen's Gambit decline with a6, as do actually a number of other modern grandmasters as well. But going back to the Slav, the thing is, at this point, we've now played c6, a6, and white just hasn't defended the c4 pawn at all. So black really needs to just take it out of principle. It's like, you know, white offered the c4 pawn on move 2, and it's not like you can really take this pawn and hold on to it, so it wasn't a real gambit here. But after black plays c6, black is already making preparations and is telling white, look, if you don't defend this pawn on c4, at some point I'm going to take it and I'm going to follow up with b5. And if you're not willing to take the pawn, then the Slav might not be the right opening for you, because at some point you can't just let your opponent just like not defend the pawn, develop their pieces freely, do whatever they want, and you never punish them, right? So at some point you have to be willing to take the pawn. Now after knight f3, it's still too early. You're not going to hold on to the pawn, so there's not a whole lot of sense in taking it here because white will just win the pawn back and have a normal position. But if white continues to just develop and continues to ignore the pawn, here d takes c4 is a very reasonable option. And the point is that white has to expend a lot of energy to try to win the pawn back. And while white is doing that, you can then develop your bishop to f5, you can play e6, you get your pieces out, you get a very decent position from black's point of view. But here after a6, Now it's like you're really telling white, like, okay, I've played c6, I've played a6. If you do not defend this pawn, I'm going to take it. I'm going to play b5. You know, I'm 100% ready to just support the pawn with b5. So if white continues to just laugh in the face of danger and not even just totally ignoring the pawn, at some point you have to take it. And this is really the moment. Because if black goes e6 here, it's like you're playing a queen's gambit declined, right? Knight f6, e6, d5, except you played c6, which is not necessarily great because a lot of times you want to play c5. And we played a6, another move that might not be the most active move. And okay, this kind of looks like a semi-Slav as well. But here it's like black just hasn't really played super ambitiously in the opening. The bishop on c8 is still stuck. And what does black have to show for this bad bishop? Not really a whole lot. So these positions, not really a ton of upside for black. White is able to just develop all their pieces normally. Black has to suffer with a bad light squared bishop. And yeah, you have to figure out some kind of dc4, b5, bishop b7, c5 plan to develop. But not the most active way to do this. So if white isn't defending the c4 pawn, black should go ahead and take this one. And there's a couple things to keep in mind here. Number one, if white takes on f6 in these kinds of positions, generally we're going to want to go ef6, just open up the bishop so you can develop, but this structure is also very solid on the king side. And something like this, for example, let's say white goes e4, black plays b5, holding onto the pawn, keeping your extra pawn. It looks like white has a nice center, but white doesn't actually have a ton of play here. We have a very healthy extra pawn. It's actually very hard for white to advance e5 or d5 here, right? Our structure is actually very, very solid. And black now has the two bishops. In particular, this dark square bishop is a really strong piece. And I think black is absolutely fine in something like this, maybe even somewhat better. So typically, I don't think white really gives up the dark square bishop here. They maybe play something like e4. Then we have to hold on to the pawn with b5. Very, very important. If you let your opponent just win back the pawn with bishop takes c4, then we have absolutely nothing for seating the center, and we're just going to be worse here. So we have to play principal chess. We have to defend this one. And it's not like white has a ton of stuff they can do here. They have compensation for sure. They have a nice center. But if e5, we have a nice square on d5. And we can play h6 to chase the bishop away. One day we'll develop with e6 and get our pieces out. And long story short, we've talked about these positions in opening labs before. Whenever you've taken this pawn on c4 and you have a somewhat questionable light squared bishop, the main plan is to try to play for this c5 break. So if you don't remember anything else from this video, just remember that when you're playing the Slav, you have this bad light squared bishop, try to play for c5. Normally that's the main break. Even if you have to give up a pawn, but you have to open up your bishop, you give back your extra pawn, but you equalize in terms of piece activity and space, and black is doing really, really well. The next thing I want to mention here is that let's say white plays a4 in this kind of position, seemingly stopping us from playing b5. This is where we have to, I guess, turn the bravery up even further. Because number one, we have to be a little bit brave to take the pawn and try to hold on to it. But here, black actually has to be willing to sacrifice the exchange. And there's a very thematic exchange sack in these kinds of positions that black really needs to know about. Now, the theory here is to start with h6. This is a useful move against bishop g5. We talked about this one a little bit earlier because it clarifies white's bishop, right? It asks the question, what are you going to do with this bishop? Are you going to trade, give up the dark square bishop, or are you going to drop back to h4 and lose the right to go back to the queen side? Or are you going to drop back this way and then kind of relinquish this pressure on the knight? And either way, I think black is kind of a little bit happier than before. If white gives up the bishop, once again, ef, dark squared bishop is quite nice here. And I think black is doing very well. In fact, right away here, we can see an example of the typical exchange sacrifice. Let's say white plays e3. Black should go ahead and play b5. And after takes, it looks like knight takes b5. White is able to win a pawn. This is the key idea Slav players really need to know. You just go ahead and play a takes b5 here and you sacrifice that exchange. The point is that after rook takes a8, let's say bishop to b7 here, black is getting a ton of play. You're getting bishop to b4 check, which is very annoying. Then black is going to be able to castle quickly, and it's going to be really hard for white to develop. So there have been quite a few games like this. For example, this position comes from the game between Jobava and Andreykin from a classical tournament in 2015. And I think black had tons and tons of counterplay here after check, knight d2, queen d6. It's just very hard for white to develop here. Notice the bishop is putting a lot of pressure on g2. So white played f3, black castled, and yeah, just had a lot of play against the dark squares here. So tons and tons of compensation here for black in this exchange sacrifice. I'll show you guys another example. I remember seeing the following game after h6, white played bishop h4. This was the game Aronian versus McShane back from 2012. I actually remember seeing this game. I was very, very impressed by this game because at the time, 2012, Levon was 28-25 FIDE, so I think he was the clear number 2 player in the world. McShane was known as like the world's strongest amateur because his FIDE rating 2,700. But professionally, he works like in finance. You know, he's not like a professional chess player. But he got invited to some top tournaments, including the Moscow. I think this was like the Tal Memorial, and he had some incredible games. One of them was against Aronian. In this game, where in this position he goes b5, and he's holding onto the pawn. White takes on b5. Black sacrifices the exchange with ab. He gets this position, bishop b7, rook has to drop back to a1, then he played g5, bishop g3, e6, and once again this bishop comes out to b4. And here we can see the point of black's h6, g5. Black got white to commit. Remember, black played h6 early, and white played bishop h4 in this game, so white committed to keeping the bishop on the king side. Now after all these exchanges happened, black goes g5 in one move, rather than h6. Imagine if white's bishop was still on g5 here and black played h6, then the bishop could drop back and be a lot more supportive. Here, white's bishop is stuck on the king side. Black gets e6, the bishop comes out to b4, and yeah, already white was just in a really, really tough spot. White had to go king e2 here, because after knight d2, the problem was knight e4, and this one is just lost. White is just losing material. So Aronian had to go king e2, black played knight c6, all the pieces come out, and yes, we are down in exchange, but the thing about exchange sacrifices, guys, I don't know if you know this, it's just a piece for a piece. You know, white has a rook and black has a minor piece. In this case, black has a knight for the rook. But it still depends on the position to figure out like who's going to come out ahead. Just because white has a rook doesn't mean the rook is going to outplay our knight. And if we look at white's other pieces, really, really not too impressive. So black was actually just crushing here. I'd recommend you guys look up the game if you want to see the whole thing. It was quite a nice one. Again, Aronian McShane from 2012. But this is kind of a key line. You know, it's like it is a little bit advanced opening theory. I don't know a lot of players that just kind of know this one off the top of their head if they don't play this opening for a while. But being willing to take the pawn and then sacrifice the exchange, I think, is going to be really key. Not just to handling this variation, there are other lines in the Slav where black should be willing to sacrifice the exchange in a similar way. This is just one where white's play is so, let's say, egregious that black should really, really take the time to punish it. So step one, we have to grab the pawn, and then step two, we definitely have to be willing to follow up with b5 to sacrifice the exchange. I like starting with this move h6, just from a theoretical point of view, to force the bishop to choose, and then you can play b5, and then white's bishop might be misplaced in the ensuing complications. Yeah, there's a very similar line in the Queen's Gambit Accepted actually nowadays, which is kind of new. In the past, it wasn't really considered playable, but now engines have determined that it is pretty playable, and that is to go, I believe it's b5 in this position, if white just goes for the main line with e4. And then in the past, white used to be able to play like this, but now black just plays a6 here, and once again sacrifices the exchange in a very, very similar way. This one is not quite as good for black. Notice the difference here is that white has the dark square bishop kind of in the game. White is going to be losing the e4 pawn, but okay, we'll be keeping a small material advantage. Here it's not as great because white's bishop, I think, is better placed, and white doesn't have to deal with all this like super annoying bishop e4 check stuff, but it's a very, very similar variation. So this kind of stuff happens QGA, Queen's Gambit Decline, Slav, Semi-Slav, a lot of different variations. But I would say this is a big turning point. If you're going to be a Slav player, this is a very, very thematic sacrifice to know about. I think every Slav player should really know this Aronian McShane game and similar. There's also a well-known game between Topalov and Van Wely. I forget the exact date, but if you look up all the games between Topalov and Van Wely, there were a couple. There was one very, very nice win by Van Wely as black. Again, very similar exchange sack in this kind of Slav position. He gets a ton of compensation and then just crushes Topalov with the black pieces. So definitely something to look into and be ready to play. So I hope, Kirk, you get some nice exchange sacks. And if you're not willing to go this route, then it's tough. But I would really advise you to do it, because if we're given a chance to go into a dynamic position with really good dynamic chances, strong exchange sack, I would say take that and play sharp chess and crush your opponents. We don't want to be, let's say, acquiescing to everything the opponent wants to do and playing moves like e6, bishop e7. I think this is a little bit too passive. I would encourage you to be more aggressive and really grab the bull by the horns. Yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of chess is learning which risks you are allowed to take and which risks you should take. And then, feeling the motivation and the confidence to actually take those risks over the board. So hopefully that helps, Kirk, and everyone else listening who is a Slav player and wasn't too sure about these ideas. And actually, that's going to wrap it up for the opening lab. Once again, we do this show once a month where I answer questions submitted from some of our Patreon supporters. If you would like to support the dojo and get some additional benefits as well, then definitely check out our Patreon page. Really do appreciate everyone that's subscribed so far. Okay, guys, that's going to do it for today.